Apache woman sneaks into Cowboy's bed to warm up, and what he saw made his heart stop. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The wind was a living thing that night, a ravenous entity clawing at the thick logs of my cabin. It shrieked across the vast snow-drowned expanse of the Montana mountains, a high, lonesome sound that for 5 years had served as my only consistent company. Since the war, since the unending noise of cannons and screaming men, this profound isolation had been a peculiar kind of balm, a self-imposed penance for surviving when so many others hadn't. The silence here, broken only by the wind and the steady crackle of the fire, was a fortress I had painstakingly built around the raw, splintered parts of my soul. But tonight, the wind sounded different. It wasn't just angry. It carried a note of raw desperation that resonated with a long-buried part of myself. My name is Jedediah Stone. I was 42, though the hard years, the lean winters, and the lingering shadow of a place called Gettysburg made me feel a lifetime older. I sat at my small hand-hewn table, the steady yellow light of a kerosene lamp pushing back the oppressive ink-black darkness. My hands, thick with calluses and mapped with the pale scars of a life lived outdoors, were methodically oiling the action of my Winchester rifle. It was a nightly ritual, a comforting habit born from years where a clean, reliable firearm was the only thing separating a man from starvation or worse. It was the only catechism I had left. The cold was a physical presence in the room, seeping through the daubing between the logs that I'd spent a week redoing that fall. It was a persistent, biting cold that gnawed at my ankles and sent shivers traveling up the thick wool of my shirt. Outside, the world had been completely swallowed by a blizzard that had raged for 2 days straight, piling drifts as high as a man's chest against the cabin walls. I was snowed and a prisoner in my own sanctuary, and that was precisely how I liked it. No people, no prying questions, no ghosts of the past trying to ambush me in the harsh light of day. Here in the frozen heart of the mountains, they mostly kept to the shadows. I had just turned in my chair, the worn wood groaning in protest, to add another log to the potbelly stove when I heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was a soft scraping sound against the outside wall near the door. The distinct sound of weight settling, of something organic and heavy disturbing the frozen crust of the snow. Every nerve in my body went taut, a jolt of pure adrenaline that was all too familiar. My fingers tightened on the cold steel of the rifle, the worn stock smooth against my cheek. In this wilderness, unexpected sounds meant one of two things: a large animal driven by hunger, or a man likely driven by something far more dangerous. I held my breath, straining my ears against the howl of the storm. The wind gusted, momentarily obscuring everything in a roar of sound. Then, in a brief, almost supernatural lull, I heard it again, a faint, desperate shuffling on my small porch, followed by the softest groan of wood, under a weight it wasn't accustomed to. My heart, a sluggish and reliable organ, began a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. I rose from my chair without a sound, my socked feet making no purchase on the cold, rough floorboards. I moved like a wraith to the side of the door, my back pressed against the logs, the Winchester held ready, its muzzle pointed toward the floor. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice a low growl, rough and gravelly from disuse. Only the wind answered, its shriek sounding like a mocking laugh. I waited motionless. A full minute passed, then 2. The profound cold from the floor was seeping into my bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I tried to rationalize the sound, telling myself it was a mountain lion seeking shelter, or maybe a bear that hadn't denned up properly. But animals, no matter how clever, didn't try door latches. And that was the next sound I heard, a faint, metallic rattle. A clumsy, weak fumbling, but it was undeniably human. My blood ran cold. No man in his right mind would be out in a storm like this. Not unless he was running from something terrible or hunting something with a desperate need. Either way, it spelled trouble, and trouble was the one thing I had sacrificed everything to escape. The fumbling stopped. There was a long, ringing silence, so profound I could hear the faint hiss of the lamp's wick. Then, with a tortured groan of frozen hinges, the door slowly, inch by agonizing inch, swung inward. A blast of frigid air and a vortex of swirling snow invaded my small, warm space, making the lamp flame dance wildly and threatening to plunge the room into darkness. A figure stood silhouetted against the churning white chaos outside. It was small, hunched, and so covered in snow it seemed a part of the storm itself. For a heartbeat, I couldn't make out what it was. Then it stumbled forward, a marionette with its strings cut, collapsing over the threshold onto the floor. The door caught by the wind, swung shut behind it with a dull final thud, plunging the room back into its dim, steady light. I moved forward, rifle leveled at the center of the heap on my floor. "Don't move," I ordered, my voice as hard and cold as iron. The figure on the floor was a person, that much was clear now. A miserable bundle of rags and snow. It lay still for a moment, and I thought perhaps the end had come right there on my floorboards. Then it stirred, pushing itself up with a shuddering, convulsive effort. It was a woman. She got to her knees. Her head bowed, her entire body shaking so violently I could see it from across the room. Snow fell from her in clumps, melting into dark, dirty puddles on the wood I had swept clean that morning. I could see now that what I had mistaken for rags was a tattered deerskin dress, thin and completely inadequate for this brutal, unforgiving cold. Her long black hair was matted with ice, and snow hanging in frozen snake-like ropes around a face I couldn't yet see. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes finding mine in the lamplight, the sight stole the breath from my lungs and squeezed my heart in a fist of ice. She was young, maybe 20 years my junior, if not more. Her face, framed by that wild, frozen hair, was starkly beautiful, with high cheekbones that could cut glass and a strong, determined jaw. But it was a beauty drawn taut with a desperation so profound it was almost terrifying. Her skin was the color of rich, firelit copper, marking her as native Crow perhaps, or Cheyenne from the look of her. Her lips were blue and cracked with cold, and her eyes were wide and dark, holding a frantic, hunted look like a doe caught in a steel trap, the terror still fresh. "Get out," I said, the words coming out harsher than I intended, an automatic defense. My fortress had been breached, and my first instinct was to repel the invader, to preserve the sanctity of my solitude. She didn't speak. She just stared at me, her chest heaving with ragged, shallow breaths that plumed in the cold air of the cabin. She tried to push herself to her feet to obey, but her legs wouldn't hold her. She sank back to her knees, a low moan of pure, unadulterated pain escaping her lips. It was then I saw her feet. She was wearing only thin, torn moccasins, soaked through and likely frozen solid to her skin. The flesh above them was raw and blackened with frostbite. A conflict raged within me, fierce and unwelcome. The part of me that had survived the war, the part that had built this solitary life as a shield, screamed at me to throw her back into the storm. She was trouble. She carried the scent of it like a perfume, a smell of desperation and violence. But another part of me, a part I thought long dead and buried under the soil of Gettysburg, saw the stark, brutal reality of her plight. To send her back out there was not just an act of cruelty. It was a death sentence, plain and simple. I would be her executioner. Cursing under my breath a low, savage sound, I lowered the rifle. The internal battle was over before it had truly begun. I had seen enough death. I couldn't be that man. "The fire," I grunted, gesturing with the barrel of the Winchester. "Get to the fire." She seemed to understand the gesture, if not the words. She began to crawl, dragging herself across the floor with a grim determination that was painful to watch. Each movement was clearly an agony. She left a trail of melted snow and something darker, a few crimson drops that stained the wood stark against the pale boards. When she reached the small circle of warmth radiating from the stove, she collapsed onto the bearskin rug beside it, curling into a tight, shivering ball, her body racked with uncontrollable shudders. I stood there for a long time, rifle still clutched in my hand, watching this wild, desperate creature that had washed up on the frozen shore of my solitude. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was no longer my silence. It was filled with her ragged breathing and the soft hiss of melting snow. My fortress had fallen, and I didn't know if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life, or if for the first time in 5 years I had done something truly human. I bolted the door, the heavy iron bolts sliding home with a finality that echoed in the small room. Then I pulled a chair to the far side of the stove, sat down with the rifle across my lap, and prepared to wait out the storm and whatever trouble had just blown in with it. For hours I just sat and watched her, a silent vigil in the heart of the storm. She didn't move except for the violent, unending shudders that shook her small frame. The lamp cast long dancing shadows on the walls, turning the familiar contents of my cabin, the stacked firewood, the hanging pots, the drying herbs, into strange, menacing shapes. My mind, usually blessedly quiet in the late hours, was a whirlwind. Who was she? Why was she alone in a blizzard, dressed for a mild fall day? The answer was obvious, written in the terror in her eyes. She was running. And the things a person runs from in these mountains are never good. Around what must have been midnight, I noticed a change. Her shivering began to subside, replaced by a stillness that was somehow more alarming. I got up, my joints protesting, and nudged her shoulder with the toe of my boot. "Hey." She didn't respond. A cold dread seeped into my gut. I knelt, my knees cracking in the quiet, and touched her neck. Her skin was like ice. Her breathing was dangerously shallow, a mere flutter. The initial violent chill was giving way to the deep, deadly cold that lulls a person to sleep forever. "Damn it," I muttered to the silent cabin. There was only one thing to be done. My cot was a simple rope bed with a straw-stuffed mattress, but it was piled high with wool blankets and heavy buffalo hides. It was the warmest place in the cabin, tucked into the far corner, away from the draftiest wall. I scooped her up into my arms. She weighed almost nothing, a fragile collection of bones wrapped in skin. Her head lolled back against my arm, and a faint, pained sound escaped her lips. I laid her on the cot and began the grim, necessary work of saving her life. Her deerskin dress was frozen stiff in places. I had to use my sharp hunting knife to carefully cut the frozen laces, the blade whispering against the material. As I pulled the tattered, damp deerskin away, I saw the full extent of her injuries. Her body was a roadmap of cruelty. Dark, ugly bruises in the shape of fingers marred the skin of her ribs and upper arms. A long, shallow cut, already inflamed and angry, ran along her collarbone. She was starved, too. Her ribs stood out like the rungs of a ladder under her skin. Whatever she was running from, it was brutal and malevolent. I worked methodically, my motions brisk and impersonal, a task to be completed. I stripped off the wet clothes and wrapped her in the driest, warmest wool blanket I had, tucking it tightly around her shivering body. Then I piled the heavy, musky buffalo hides on top. Her feet were the worst. The moccasins were frozen to her skin. I had to slowly, patiently pour lukewarm water over them, a little at a time, from the kettle on the stove, until I could ease them off. The flesh beneath was swollen, and a terrifying shade of waxy white and angry red. It was bad frostbite. She might lose her toes, if not her feet. I found my tin of salve, a pungent mix of pine resin and bear grease I used for burns and saddle sores, and gently, carefully, I coated her feet before wrapping them in clean strips torn from an old shirt. Through it all, she remained mostly unconscious, occasionally moaning softly, her brow furrowed in a pain she was too deep under to fully register. When I was done, I stood back, breathing heavily. The cabin felt hot, stuffy, with the smell of wet wool and pine salve. My own shirt was damp with sweat. She was just a small mound under the mountain of blankets, her jet-black hair a stark, shocking contrast against the white of my pillowcase. There was no question of me sleeping on the floor. In this cold, with the fire banked for the night, it was a death sentence. With a resigned sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the last 5 years, I blew out the lamp. The only light now was the faint orange glow from the stove's grate, painting the room in shades of fire and shadow. I lay down on the very edge of the cot, on top of the buffalo hides, my body rigid, a wide, deliberate space between us. My rifle was on the floor beside me, within easy reach. I lay there, staring into the darkness, listening to the howl of the wind, a sound I knew so well, and to a new sound, the soft, fragile rhythm of her breathing. It was the first time in 5 years that another human heartbeat had shared my space through the long, dark night. And as the storm raged outside, I felt the walls of my fortress and the walls around my heart begin to crack. Sleep, for the first time in a long time, did not come easy. The first hint of dawn was a weak gray light that filtered through my single frost-covered window. The wind had finally died down, leaving behind an eerie, muffled silence, as if the world had been wrapped in cotton. The world outside was buried. I woke instantly, every sense on high alert, the ingrained habit of years spent in hostile territory. My first thought was of her. I turned my head. She was still there, a small shape under the hides. Sometime during the night, drawn by instinct, she had turned toward me, seeking the warmth of another body. One of her hands lay on the blanket between us, palm up, vulnerable. In the faint gray light, I could see the delicacy of her fingers, the grime under her nails that spoke of a hard journey. Her face was relaxed in sleep, the terror gone, replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion that seemed to emanate from her very bones. Her breathing was even a soft, rhythmic whisper. She was alive. I slipped off the cot as quietly as a shadow. The floorboards were punishingly cold against my bare feet. I stoked the fire in the stove, adding fresh logs until it roared back to life, then set the big enamel coffee pot on to boil. The familiar ritual grounded me. The smell of strong coffee, the growing warmth of the stove, these were the anchors of my solitary existence. But today everything felt different. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the presence of another soul. As the coffee began to perk its rich aroma filling the small cabin, she stirred. A soft sound left her throat, and her eyes fluttered open. For a moment they were unfocused, hazy with sleep. Then they found me standing by the stove. Fear, sharp and immediate, flashed across her face like lightning. She jolted upright, pulling the blankets tighter around her, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar cabin before locking back on me. They were the eyes of a cornered animal, ready to fight or flee, her body coiled like a spring. "Easy," I said, my voice low and calm, trying to soothe her. I held up my empty hands, palms out, to show I meant no harm. "You're safe here. The storm, you were near frozen." She didn't relax. Her gaze was sharp, suspicious, watching my every move as I poured 2 cups of coffee into tin mugs. I set one on the small crate that served as my nightstand, a safe distance from the cot. I took my own and retreated to my chair by the fire, deliberately putting space between us. "It's coffee," I said. "It'll warm you." She stared at the steaming mug for a long time, as if it might be a trick, a trap. Then slowly, cautiously, she reached out a trembling hand and wrapped her fingers around it, drawing it close. She held it under her nose, letting the steam rise into her face, her eyes never leaving mine over the rim of the cup. She took a small, tentative sip, then another. We sat like that for what felt like an hour in complete, unbroken silence, drinking our coffee on opposite sides of the room. I watched her and she watched me. I could see the thoughts racing behind her eyes, the fear warring with a bone-deep exhaustion. I felt like a man trying to gentle a wild horse, knowing that one wrong move, one sudden gesture, and she would bolt, no matter the cost to herself. Finally, I broke the silence, my voice softer than before. "My name is Jedediah." "Jed." She flinched at the sound of my voice, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor, but she didn't look away. She said nothing, her silence a wall. "You need to eat," I continued, getting up slowly, telegraphing my movements. I moved to the shelf where I kept my supplies and took down a slab of salt pork and a bag of cornmeal. She watched my every step, her body tensed, ready for anything. I cooked breakfast in silence, the sizzle of the pork in the cast-iron skillet the only sound in the cabin. The smell filled the small space, rich and hearty. I knew from the look of her that she must be starving. When it was done, I put a plate on the crate beside her cot with 2 pieces of fried pork and a thick slice of fried cornbread. She stared at the food with a raw, naked hunger that was almost painful to see, but she didn't eat. She looked from me to the plate and back again, a deep, ingrained suspicion in her eyes. I understood. In her world, a world that had carved scars on her skin, nothing was given for free. Everything had a price. I took my own plate and sat back down in my chair, turning slightly away from her to give her the illusion of privacy. I ate slowly, deliberately. After a few minutes of tense silence, I heard the faint scrape of a fork against the tin plate. When I risked a glance over, she was eating, wolfing the food down with a desperate, hurried intensity, as if she feared it would be snatched away. When she was finished, she pushed the plate away and pulled the blankets back up to her chin, her eyes holding a sliver of cautious gratitude mixed with the ever-present fear. She still hadn't said a word. "You need to rest," I told her. "Your feet are bad. Frostbite. You can't walk on them." She looked down at the mound her bandaged feet made under the blankets, her expression unreadable, a mask of stoicism. I spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened awareness, every nerve thrumming. I went about my usual chores, splitting more wood for the stove, checking the snares I had set near the cabin, melting snow for water. But part of my mind was always on her, on the silent woman in my bed. I never strayed far from the cabin. I left the door unbolted, a gesture of trust I wasn't sure I felt, but one I felt was necessary. Each time I came back inside, stomping the snow from my boots, I'd find her exactly where I left her. Sitting up on the cot, the blankets clutched around her, watching the door, waiting. The silence between us was heavy, thick with unspoken questions. Her presence had utterly shattered the careful solitude I had cultivated. The cabin, which had always felt like a snug, protective shell, now seemed small and crowded. I found myself moving carefully, deliberately, acutely conscious of the fact that I was no longer alone. It was an unsettling, disruptive feeling. Late in the afternoon, I came back in to find her trying to stand. She had pushed the heavy blankets aside and was attempting to put her weight on her feet. A sharp cry of pain escaped her, and she crumpled back onto the cot, her face pale and beaded with sweat. "I told you not to walk on them," I said. My voice sharper than I intended, laced with a frustration that was directed more at the situation than at her. I crossed the room in 2 long strides. "Let me see." She shrank back as I approached her body, instinctively recoiling, but she didn't fight me. She allowed me to lift her feet onto my lap and carefully unwrap the makeshift bandages. They were swollen and inflamed, the skin a frightening, angry purple. It looked bad. I worked in silence, cleaning them as best I could with warm water and applying more of the pine salve. My touch was as gentle as I could manage, but I saw her wince, with each dab biting her lip hard to keep from crying out. Her skin was soft beneath my rough, calloused hands. The contact was strangely intimate, and it sent an unwelcome jolt through me, a feeling I hadn't experienced in a very long time. I finished the work quickly and rewrapped them with fresh strips of cloth. "You stay put," I ordered gruffly, standing up and turning away my own emotions in turmoil. "You walk on them now, you'll lose them for sure." This was getting complicated. A nameless, voiceless woman was now under my care in my bed. I was responsible for her. It was a responsibility I had not sought and did not want. And yet the thought of her being permanently crippled by her ordeal filled me with a cold dread. That evening I made a simple stew of dried venison and potatoes. I gave her a bowl, and this time she ate without hesitation, her eyes occasionally flicking up to meet mine. As I was banking the fire for the night, preparing for the long, cold hours ahead, she finally spoke. Her voice was low and raspy from disuse, barely a whisper. "Lena." I turned surprised. She was looking at me, her dark eyes luminous in the firelight. She touched her chest lightly, a gesture of introduction. "My name, Lena. Jedediah," I repeated, my own name sounding strange in the shared space. "Jed." She nodded, testing the name on her lips in a whisper. "Jed." It was a start. A name, a single word that broke the long, tense silence and began ever so slightly to bridge the chasm between us. That night I once again laid down on the very edge of the cot. The space between us felt smaller, the tension different. It was no longer the tension between a man and a potential threat, but the delicate, charged tension between a man and a woman. A stranger, yes, but a woman nonetheless. And as I lay in the dark, listening to the soft, steady sound of her breathing, I had to admit to myself that a part of me, a deeply buried, achingly lonely part, was glad she was there. My 5 years of chosen silence had been broken, and the sound that replaced it was the name Lena. The days that followed settled into a strange, quiet rhythm dictated by the storm's aftermath and Lena's slow healing. The blizzard had passed, leaving the world outside transformed into a pristine, deadly wilderness of white. We were truly snowbound, marooned on a mountain island. For me, it was a familiar state. For her, it was a cage, but also I began to realize a sanctuary. Lena healed slowly, patiently. Her feet remained swollen and painful, and she stayed on the cot for the better part of a week. The silence between us was no longer heavy and suspicious, but had softened into something comfortable, companionable. We spoke little, our words reserved for necessities, but a silent understanding began to grow in the spaces between them. I would cook and she would eat. I would tend to her feet twice a day, and she would allow it with a quiet, watchful trust that humbled me. I learned to read her without words. I saw the way her eyes followed me as I moved about the cabin, a mixture of caution and a dawning curiosity. I saw the tension that would momentarily tighten her shoulders when I sharpened my hunting knife, a flicker of old fear that was a ghost of what she'd fled. And I saw the way she would sometimes stare out the frosted window for long stretches, her gaze distant and filled with a sorrow so deep it made my own old wounds ache in sympathy. One afternoon I sat by the fire, mending a tear in my heavy wool coat, my big fingers clumsy with the needle and thread. She watched me for a while from the cot, a faint, almost imperceptible line of amusement on her lips. Then in her quiet voice she said, "Here." She held out her hand. I hesitated for a moment, then passed her the coat and needle. She propped herself up against the wall, the heavy coat spread across her lap. Her fingers, though still slender and marked by hardship, were surprisingly deft. She worked with a focused intensity, her stitches small, neat, and efficient. It was a simple domestic act, but in the context of our strange cohabitation it felt profound. A woman was mending my coat by my fire. The cabin for the first time began to feel less like a hermit's refuge and more like a home. When she finished, she held it up for my inspection. The seam was stronger and cleaner than anything I could have managed. "It's good work," I said, my voice gruff with an emotion I couldn't name. "Thank you." She gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod and handed the coat back. Her fingers brushed mine, and the brief accidental contact sent a warmth spreading up my arm. I pulled back quickly, unsettled by my own reaction, and busied myself with the fire. That evening, as the shadows grew long and the fire cast a warm, dancing glow on the log walls, a new intimacy bloomed. As I was banking the fire for the night, she spoke again, her voice low. "The men, they follow." The question hung in the air, heavy and cold. It was the first time she had acknowledged the specific danger that had driven her into the teeth of the storm. I turned and looked at her. Her face was serious in the firelight, her eyes searching mine for the truth. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "The snow is deep, deeper than I've seen in years. No one is traveling now. For now you are safe." "For now," she repeated softly the words, a somber echo that seemed to hold all the uncertainty of the world. She shifted on the cot, moving closer to the wall and making a small space on her side. It was a clear, unspoken invitation. My heart hammered against my ribs. For a week I had slept rigidly on the edge, maintaining a chasm of propriety between us. But the cold was relentless, and the fire, though steady, couldn't warm the entire cabin through the long dark nights. Sharing body heat was a matter of survival in this climate. It was a practical matter. I told myself it was only for the warmth. I lay down in the space she had made, my back to her, every muscle in my body tensed. The cot was small, and I was acutely, powerfully aware of her presence behind me, the faint scent of wood smoke and something uniquely her own. The straw mattress shifted as she settled down. For a long time we lay there, not touching, two separate souls adrift in the darkness. Then I felt a tentative, hesitant warmth against my back. She had shifted closer, her body radiating a heat that contrasted with the ever-present chill in the air. I did not pull away. A slow, unfamiliar peace began to settle over me. For the first time in 5 long years, I was not entirely alone in the darkness. The ghosts of my past still lingered in the corners of the room, their whispers fainter, now pushed back by the simple, profound presence of another living, breathing soul. And in the deep, frozen silence of the Montana winter, I slept more soundly than I had in years. By the second week, Lena was able to limp around the cabin. Her feet, though still tender and wrapped in bandages, were healing. The raw, frostbitten skin was being replaced by new pink flesh. With her mobility came a subtle but significant change in the cabin's atmosphere. She began to take on small tasks, moving with a quiet grace that transformed the cluttered masculine space. She swept the floor with a broom I'd fashioned from pine boughs. She organized my haphazard shelves, stacking my tins of beans and sacks of flour with a neatness I hadn't known the place was capable of. She was nesting, creating order from my chaos. She never spoke of her past, and I never asked. It was a locked room, and I felt I had no right to demand the key. But I pieced together a story from the shadows in her eyes and the pale, faded scars on her skin. She had been captured, or perhaps sold to a cruel man. She had been brutalized, treated as property. And she had escaped, choosing the near-certain death of a blizzard over the men who were her captors. Her courage was a quiet, unyielding thing. A steel spine in her slender frame that I found myself deeply, profoundly admiring. One day I decided the cabin was becoming too small for both of us, the air too thick with unspoken things. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, the air clear, and still the sun bright on the blinding snow. "Come," I said, "we'll check the trap line. The fresh air will do you good." I took great care in preparing her. I wrapped her feet in extra layers of wool and soft leather before helping her into a spare pair of my own oversized boots, which I stuffed with straw for insulation. I found an old worn coat of mine which swallowed her small frame, but I knew it would keep her warm against the biting air. The world outside was breathtakingly beautiful and stark. The snow was so deep we had to use the snowshoes I had made. I led the way, packing down a trail for her to follow. She moved slowly but steadily, her eyes wide as she took in the vast, silent, white-draped landscape. For the first time, a small, genuine smile touched her lips as she pointed to a delicate set of rabbit tracks stitched across the snow. The sight of that smile did something strange to my chest, a painful, pleasant lurch. We worked the trap line together. I showed her how to reset a snare, my large, rough hands brushing against hers as I guided her. She was a quick learner, her movements economical and precise. We moved in a comfortable silence, a team. The thought was new and startling. I had been a solitary creature for so long, the idea of a team of we was foreign territory. On the way back, as the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, painting the snow in shades of deep pink and brilliant orange, she stumbled in the deep powder. I reached out and caught her arm to steady her. She looked up at me, her face just inches from mine. The cold had brought a rosy flush to her cheeks, and her eyes, dark and deep, held a new light. Not fear, but something softer, questioning, and intensely female. The world seemed to fall away. There was only the immense silence of the mountains, the crisp, cold air on my face, and the surprising warmth of her arm under my hand. I could feel the delicate pulse beating in her wrist. My own heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I leaned in slowly, deliberately, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. She closed her eyes. I kissed her. It was a gentle, tentative kiss, as soft and as hesitant as the first falling snowflakes of a storm. Her lips were cold at first, tasting of the winter air, then warmed under mine. It was a kiss of shared solitude, of profound gratitude, of a dawning unspoken affection that neither of us had expected to find in this frozen wasteland. It was over as quickly as it began. We pulled apart, both of us breathless in the thin mountain air. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. Something had shifted between us irrevocably. The unspoken space that had separated us was now charged with a new, vibrant, and slightly terrifying energy. That night, when we lay down on the cot, there was no pretense of it being only for warmth. I turned to face her in the flickering firelight, and she turned to face me. I reached out a trembling hand and traced the elegant line of her cheekbone with my thumb. She leaned into my touch, a small, trusting sound deep in her throat, her hand coming up to rest on my chest, right over my furiously beating heart. The fortress I had so carefully constructed around myself for 5 long years had not just been breached. Its walls had crumbled to dust, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. And I found that I was not afraid. For the first time in a very long time, I felt something other than the dull, persistent ache of survival. I felt the fragile, terrifying, and unmistakable stirring of hope. And as another night closed in on our small, isolated world, I pulled her close, no longer just her protector, but something more. In the heart of that unforgiving winter, we had found in each other a surprising and desperate refuge. The thaw came not in the weather, which remained bitingly cold and locked in winter's grip, but between us. The kiss in the snow had changed everything. The nights were no longer about the practical necessity of survival, but about a deep and profound connection that unfolded in the quiet darkness. We became lovers, our coming together as natural and as necessary as the fire in the stove, a slow, gentle exploration of comfort and healing. In the darkness of the cabin, wrapped in heavy buffalo hides, we found a language beyond words, a way of soothing the scars the world had left on both of us. Her quietness remained, for it was her nature, but it was no longer a silence born of fear. She began to smile, more small, genuine smiles that would light up her face and make my old cynical heart ache with a feeling I couldn't quite name. She would tell me little things about her childhood, her voice soft as she described the way her mother taught her to bead intricate patterns, the smell of wild sage after a summer rain. She spoke of her people, the people of the river, and a deep sorrow colored her words as she talked of their vanishing way of life. But she never spoke the names of the men she had fled, and her recent past remained a shrouded, dark country I did not try to enter. For my part, I found myself talking, truly talking, for the first time in years. The words long dammed up inside me began to flow. I told her about my family's farm in Ohio, about the green hills and the slow-moving river, a life that seemed to belong to another man. I told her about my younger brother Thomas, and how I'd held him as he died at Antietam. I spoke of the ghosts that had followed me home from the war, the ones that had driven me to this lonely mountain. Speaking the words aloud to her in the safe, warm confines of our cabin seemed to rob them of some of their terrible power. She would listen, her dark eyes filled with a deep, knowing empathy, her hand resting on my arm, a silent anchor in the turbulent waters of my memory. The cabin transformed. It became our world. Her touch was everywhere, in the neatly stacked firewood by the stove, the clean-swept floor, the way my mended clothes smelled faintly of wood smoke, and her. She had a way of bringing a quiet, gentle order to my chaotic, solitary existence. One evening, she sat on the bearskin rug by the fire, combing her long black hair. The firelight danced on it, making it shine like a raven's wing. I sat at the table, cleaning my revolver, the familiar methodical task, a comforting rhythm. "Jed," she said softly, her back still to me. When the snow melts, they will come." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of inevitable fact. The easy peace of the evening shattered like thin ice. I stopped my work, the cold, heavy reality of her words sinking into my bones. We had been living in a bubble, a temporary paradise forged in a blizzard. But the spring would come, the mountain passes would clear, and with them the world and all its dangers would return. "I know," I said, my voice tight. She turned to look at me, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. You are one man. I agreed. But this is my land. My home. I paused, meeting her gaze, the words feeling truer than anything I had ever said. Our home. And I protect what's mine. A flicker of something, gratitude, fear, love, passed through her eyes. She gave a single sharp nod, a gesture of complete understanding, then turned back to the fire. The conversation was over, but a new unspoken understanding had been forged between us. We were no longer just two lost souls who had found comfort in each other. We were partners, and a storm of a different kind was coming. The first true sign of the thaw arrived a week later. A faint, persistent dripping sound from the eaves of the cabin. The snow, packed hard and deep, began to recede from the cabin walls, exposing patches of frozen, muddy earth. The creek at the bottom of the valley, long silent under a thick blanket of ice, began to roar with the sound of meltwater. The world was waking up, and with it my old soldier's vigilance returned, sharper and colder than ever. I spent my days outside, my rifle never far from my hand. I'd climb the rocky ridge behind the cabin, my eyes scanning the long winding valley below for any sign of movement, any curl of smoke that wasn't my own. Lena watched me, her face calm but her eyes shadowed with a shared anxiety. She began her own preparations. She sharpened my kitchen knives on my whetstone until they had a razor's edge. She made sure our dwindling supplies were meticulously organized, that we had enough dried meat and flour to last a siege. She was no fragile flower waiting for rescue. She was a survivor, and she was preparing for a war. One afternoon I took her out and began teaching her to handle the Winchester. It was heavy and awkward in her small hands, but she was a determined student. Her jaw was set, her eyes focused as she learned to work the lever action to load the cartridges, to sight down the long barrel until it felt like an extension of her arm. "They come, you stay inside," I told her, my hands guiding hers as she aimed at a distant pine knot. "But you be ready." She looked up at me, her gaze fierce and unwavering. "I do not hide," she said, her voice low and firm, each word ringing with conviction. "Not again." Her strength, her absolute refusal to be a victim, stirred something deep and fiercely protective within me. I cupped her face in my hands and kissed her, a hard, desperate kiss filled with the fear of what was to come and the powerful, consuming love I felt for her. The day it happened was bright and deceptively peaceful. A Chinook wind had blown in, warm and strange, melting the snow with astonishing speed. The valley floor was a muddy patchwork of brown and white. I was splitting logs in the yard, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady beat when I saw them. Two riders far down the valley, moving steadily, relentlessly toward my cabin. My blood ran cold. I dropped the axe, its handle clattering against the logs, and went inside. "They're here," I said, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. Lena was already at the window. She had seen them too. She turned to me, her face pale but resolute. Without a word, she took the Winchester down from its pegs on the wall and calmly checked the load. "Two of them," I said, grabbing my own rifle. "Go to the side window. It covers the approach. Stay out of sight. Don't fire unless I do." She nodded, her eyes locking with mine for a long, silent moment. In that single look, everything was said. Then she moved to her position, melting into the shadows of the cabin's interior. I stepped out onto the porch, my rifle held loosely in my hand, and waited. They rode up slowly with the easy confidence of predators who have cornered their prey. They were rough-looking men with hard, mean eyes and clothes that had seen better days. One was older, with a scraggly graying beard and a cruel twist to his mouth. This had to be their leader, Silas Croft. The other was younger, with a cocky, arrogant swagger even in the saddle. That would be Finn. They stopped about 30 yards from my porch, their horses stamping impatiently. "Howdy," Croft called out, his voice oily, a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "We're looking for something that belongs to us." "Nothing here belongs to you," I said, my voice even and cold as a tombstone. Finn laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that grated on the peaceful air. "We're looking for a squaw. Ran off from us a few months back. We tracked her to this valley." He squinted at me in the cabin. "You ain't seen her, have you, old man?" My grip on my rifle tightened until my knuckles were white. "The only thing I see is two men trespassing on my property. I suggest you turn around and ride back the way you came." Croft's false smile vanished. "Now we don't want no trouble. We're reasonable men. Just give her back. She ain't nothing to you." "You heard me," I said, raising the rifle just a fraction, the movement slight but unmistakable. "Leave." For a long moment they just stared at me, the silence stretching taut. I could feel their anger, their frustration. They had come a long way for this. They weren't going to give up easily. Then Finn's eyes narrowed, his gaze dropping to the muddy ground by the woodpile, where a second smaller set of boot prints were clearly visible in the thawing earth. His hand drifted down toward the butt of the pistol holstered on his hip. That was all the warning I needed. I brought the rifle to my shoulder in one smooth, practiced motion. Don't even think about it. Croft held up a hand, a gesture that stopped his partner cold. He gave me a long, calculating look, assessing the set of my jaw, the steadiness of my aim. Then he spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "This ain't over," he snarled. He pulled his horse around the younger one, following his lead, his face sullen. They rode away, not looking back. I stayed on the porch, my rifle trained on their backs until they were just specks in the distance. Only then did I allow myself to take a deep, shuddering breath. The adrenaline left me feeling shaky and cold despite the warm Chinook wind. I went back inside. Lena was standing where I had left her, the rifle still clutched in her hands. She was trembling slightly, but her eyes were dry and fierce. She carefully put the rifle down and came to me, wrapping her arms around my waist and burying her face in my chest. I held her tight, stroking her hair, my own heart still pounding a frantic rhythm against her cheek. "They'll be back," she whispered against my shirt. "I know," I said, "and we'll be ready." That night, there was a new desperation to our lovemaking, a fierce, almost violent claiming of each other in the face of the coming storm. We both knew the peace we had found was fragile, and that we would have to fight to keep it. The world we had escaped was coming for us, and the walls of my cabin, once my refuge from the world, would now have to become our fortress against it. We didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, they returned, and this time there were 5 of them. I spotted them early, 5 riders moving with grim purpose up the valley floor. There was no pretense of a casual visit this time. They were fanned out in a skirmish line. They meant to finish it. "They're back," I said, my voice a low growl. 5 of them. Lena was by my side in an instant. Her face was set like stone. We had planned for this. We had spent the last 2 days fortifying the cabin, reinforcing the door with an iron bar, and setting up firing positions at the 2 small windows. "Remember the plan," I said, grabbing her arm and looking her deep in the eyes. "Let them get close. We make every shot count. Aim for the center of the man." She nodded her hand briefly, covering mine in a gesture of solidarity. "I am not afraid, Jed." I knew she wasn't, and in that moment my love for her was a fierce burning thing that consumed all fear. I would die on this mountain before I let them lay a hand on her. I took my position at the front window, and she took the one at the side, which covered the approach to the porch and the woodpile. The cabin fell into a tense, expectant silence, broken only by the sound of our own breathing and the distant rhythmic thud of hoofbeats. They rode into the yard and dismounted, spreading out to surround the cabin like wolves. Croft and Finn were there, along with 3 other hard-faced men I didn't recognize. They all carried rifles. Stonecroft shouted, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Last chance, send out the girl and we'll let you live." I didn't answer. I just settled the worn stock of my Winchester against my shoulder, sighted on Croft's chest, and waited. "Have it your way," he bellowed. He gave a signal, and his men started to advance on the cabin from different directions, using the trees and the woodpile for cover. The world narrowed to the space between my rifle sights. The first man, a big bearded fellow we would later know as Boone, broke from cover, running low toward the side of the cabin toward Lena's position. I heard the sharp crack of her Winchester before I could even pivot. The man screamed a high, thin sound and went down, clutching his leg. 1 down. The other 4 immediately opened fire. A hail of bullets slammed into the log walls of the cabin, sending splinters flying through the air. The noise was deafening, a roar that filled our small fortress. I fired at Croft, who had dived behind my woodpile. The shot was high, tearing a chunk of bark from the log above his head, and he ducked back under cover. It was a standoff. They had us pinned down, but they couldn't advance without exposing themselves to our fire. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The cabin filled with the acrid, biting smell of gunpowder. Then one of the men Pike tried to make a run for the back of the cabin, where there was no window, a blind spot. I caught the movement out of the corner of my eye. I fired, but he was fast weaving like a snake. He made it to the back wall. "He's at the back," I shouted to Lena over the din. The door, I heard a heavy scraping sound at the back of the cabin. He was going to try to break the door down with an axe. Lena moved from her window, her face a mask of cold fury. She stood to the side of the heavy door, the Winchester held ready at her hip. "Now, Jed," she yelled, her voice clear and strong. I understood. It was a desperate, insane gamble. I laid down a volley of covering fire toward the other men, forcing them to keep their heads down, levering and firing as fast as I could. The instant I stopped firing in the ringing silence that followed, Lena threw the bolt and yanked the door open. The man outside was caught completely by surprise. He was just raising a heavy wood-splitting axe to swing. For a fraction of a second, he stared at her, his face a mixture of shock and rage. It was the last expression he ever had. Lena fired from the hip. The blast contained in the small space was deafening. It threw the man backward into the mud as if he'd been hit by a cannonball. 2 down. She slammed the door and threw the bolt just as another bullet tore through the thick wood where she had been standing an instant before. The 2 remaining men who could still fight, Croft and a lanky man named Carter, had had enough. They had lost 2 of their number and wounded another and hadn't even gotten inside. I saw Croft grab the wounded Boone, haul him unceremoniously onto his horse, and the 3 of them, Croft, Carter, and the now useless Finn, rode off, firing a few last angry shots at the cabin before disappearing down the valley at a gallop. Silence descended. It was a shocking, deafening silence broken only by the ringing in my ears. The air was thick with smoke. Outside, one man lay dead. Slowly, I lowered my rifle. It was over. Lena leaned against the wall, her eyes closed, her chest heaving. She had taken a life to save ours. I went to her and pulled her into my arms. She was shaking not from fear, but from the savage, brutal aftermath of violence. I held her until the trembling stopped. Then she looked up at me, her dark eyes clear and steady. "It is finished," she whispered. "It's finished," I confirmed, my voice thick with emotion. I kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. We had faced their world and we had won. We buried the dead man that evening, a grim, silent task that solidified the price of our freedom. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. That night, we didn't go to the cot. We lay together on the bearskin rug in front of the fire, our bodies intertwined. The firelight danced on her skin, on the strong, beautiful lines of her face. We held each other not in passion, but in a profound, soul-deep comfort. We had been forged in a crucible of ice and fire, and we had emerged not unscathed, but whole. Together. As I lay there, her head resting on my chest, her soft, even breathing. The only sound in the world, I looked around the small, battered, bullet-scarred cabin. It was more than just logs and mud and chinking. It was the place I had been reborn. It was the place I had found a reason to live, not just to survive. The long winter was finally over. Outside, the world was coming alive with the promise of spring. The creek was running free, and the first green shoots were pushing their way through the last of the snow. And inside, in the heart of my once lonely fortress, so was I. Anawa was my refuge and I was hers. We were home.